The stagecoach came to a stop in a cloud of red dust, and the woman who stepped down from it carried nothing but a single canvas bag and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have learned not to show what they feel. Her name was Willa Voss. She was 26 years old, and she had traveled for 11 days to reach this place. She stood on the edge of the main street of Harlow Creek and looked at what was before her. A row of weathered storefronts leaning slightly into each other like tired old men. A water trough with a crack running along its base. A barber shop with a sign so sun-bleached the letters had nearly disappeared. 2 horses tied at a post outside a dry goods store, patient and motionless in the afternoon heat. The sky above it all was enormous and pale, the kind of sky that made everything beneath it feel very small and very far from anything that mattered. She waited. The stagecoach driver handed down a trunk to another passenger, tipped his hat, and clicked the horses forward without looking at her again. The dust settled slowly. The street went on about its business. A woman in a gray dress crossed from one side to the other without glancing up. A boy chased a dog around the corner of the feed store and disappeared. Somewhere behind her, a door opened and closed. No one came to meet her. Willa set her canvas bag down on the step of the nearest building and looked up the length of the street again, more carefully this time, as if she might have missed something on the first pass. She had not. The street was what it was. Harlow Creek was what it was. And the man she had come to marry was not here. She picked up her bag and walked to the nearest person she could find. An older man sitting outside the barber shop in a wooden chair, his hat pulled low against the glare. She said the name, Caleb Hart. She said it clearly and without hesitation, the way she had practiced saying it on the long days of travel when there was nothing to do but think about what came next. The old man looked up at her. He did not answer right away. He reached up with one weathered hand and removed his hat from his head and held it against his chest. And that was how she knew. She had seen that gesture before. She knew exactly what it meant. She stood very still while he told her. 3 weeks ago, a fever that came on fast and did not slow down. There had been no time to send word because nobody had known she was on her way. Caleb Hart had not told anyone she was coming. Perhaps he had meant to. Perhaps he had planned to write to her again once everything was settled, once the arrangements were made, once he was certain enough to say it out loud. But he had run out of time, and the letter never came. And Willa had packed her single canvas bag and climbed into a stagecoach and traveled 11 days to a town that did not know she was arriving. She thanked the old man. She meant it. He had been kind in the way he told her, and kindness was not something to take lightly. Then she walked to the nearest step she could find and sat down on it, and she looked out at the street of Harlow Creek, and she breathed in the dry, hot air of this strange place, and she did not cry. She had done her crying for other things already, for her father, who had passed in the early part of the year and left her with a clean name and very little else, for the man before Caleb, the one who had promised her a different kind of future, and then quietly disappeared when that future became complicated. She had cried for those things in private, in the dark, in the way that women who have no one to cry, to learn to cry, silently, and then done with it. She was not going to cry now for a man she had never met. What she did instead was sit and think, and after a few minutes she lifted her head and asked the old man one more question. She asked who handled what Caleb Hart had left behind. The old man thought about this. He told her there was a lawyer's office on the far end of the street. a man named Pruitt who had handled most of the legal matters in Harlow Creek for the better part of 20 years. He told her that Caleb had a brother somewhere who had been sent for. He did not know if the brother had arrived yet. Willa picked up her bag, thanked him again, and walked toward the far end of the street. She did not look back. Garrett Hart had arrived in Harlow Creek 2 days earlier, and he had not slept well in either of them. He was 35 years old, and he ran a cattle operation on the far side of the valley, a modest stretch of land that he had worked alone for the better part of a decade, ever since things had changed and staying in one place with too many memories had stopped feeling like home and started feeling like something else. He had built the operation from almost nothing through the kind of work that does not leave room for much else, and he preferred it that way. Work was simple. Work had clear edges. You knew what you were doing, and you knew when you were done. People were considerably more complicated. He had come when the letter reached him, because Caleb was his brother, and that was the end of the reasoning required. The ride had taken most of a day, and he had arrived to find the ranch empty and the accounts in disarray, and a debt ledger that made his jaw tighten every time he looked at it. Caleb had never been careful with money. That was an old story. Garrett had stopped being surprised by it years ago. He had simply set his hat on the table and started going through the papers one by one, the way he went through everything, methodically, without complaint, because complaining changed nothing, and the papers still needed reading either way. He had been in Pruitt's office twice already, working through the legal details of the estate, and he had returned this afternoon to go over one more document when Pruitt told him. The woman was here. She had just been in to ask about the estate. She was waiting in the outer room. Garrett sat with that information for a moment. He had known she was coming, in the abstract way that one knows about a thing without fully believing in it. Caleb had mentioned the arrangement in passing, the way Caleb mentioned most things, casually, as if the details would sort themselves out. A woman from back east. A mail order arrangement. Someone to help with the house, he had said, and then added with the particular vagueness that meant he did not want to be questioned further. Someone to start over with. Garrett had not said much in response. It was not his life to manage. Caleb was a grown man and entitled to make his own arrangements, however ill-considered they sometimes turned out to be. But Caleb was gone now, and the woman was in the outer room, and someone had to go speak to her. Garrett stood up, adjusted his hat, and went through the door. She was sitting in the plain wooden chair against the wall, her canvas bag on the floor beside her feet, her hands folded in her lap with the careful composure of someone who has spent a long time making sure their hands don't give anything away. She was not what he had expected, though he could not have said with any precision what he had expected. Something softer, perhaps. Something more visibly distressed. A woman who had just learned that the man she traveled 11 days to marry had been dead for 3 weeks might reasonably be expected to look considerably more undone than this one did. She looked up when he came in. Her eyes were gray, or perhaps blue in certain light, the kind of color that shifts depending on the angle. She did not smile, and she did not wilt, and she did not say anything at all. She simply waited for him to speak first, which he found, unexpectedly, that he appreciated. He told her who he was. She told him who she was, though he had already guessed. He sat down in the chair across from her because standing over someone while delivering difficult information seemed like the wrong posture for it, and Caleb's letter had mentioned the arrangement enough that he understood she was not simply a stranger passing through. Pruitt came in behind him and set the papers on the low table between them and let them both read through the relevant sections in silence. The contract Caleb had signed was more detailed than Garrett had expected. Caleb had never been a detailed man. That, too, was an old story. And yet here, in a document he had apparently drawn up through a lawyer in the town where Willa had been living, were several pages of very precise language. The arrangement had been formalized with more care than Caleb usually applied to anything. Garrett read through it twice. The clause that stopped him was near the bottom of the second page. In the event that the party of the first part is unable to fulfill the terms of the arrangement due to circumstances beyond his control, the party of the second part shall be entitled to reside at the property for a period not to exceed 90 days, during which time the estate shall be settled and fair provision made for her departure. 90 days. Garrett looked up from the paper. Willa was watching him with the focused attention of someone who had already read the relevant section and was now waiting to see what he would do with it. He said, "Caleb signed this." She said, "He did." The silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people taking stock of a situation neither of them had chosen, and both of them were going to have to live inside for a while. Pruitt cleared his throat, which was the sound of a man about to make a difficult situation more complicated. Garrett looked at him. The lawyer set down another document. This one was thicker, bound with a ribbon that had once been red and was now a faded pink. He explained it in the measured way of someone who has explained difficult things many times and has learned to do it without expression. Caleb had left debt. That was not a surprise. But the amount was larger than the initial figures had suggested, because there was a second ledger that Garrett had not yet seen, and that ledger contained an entry that changed the picture considerably. There was a contract, signed, witnessed, legally binding, between Caleb Hart and a woman named Dorla Fuller, who owned a considerable portion of the land and property on the south end of Harlow Creek, and several other places besides. Under the terms of that contract, the ranch was to be sold. Garrett kept his face still. It was something he had practice at. Pruitt continued. The sale was to be completed within 60 days of the signing, which meant the clock had already been running for some time before Caleb passed. 12 days had elapsed already. Mrs. Fuller's lawyers had been in contact. The timeline had not changed simply because the man who signed the document was no longer alive. If the estate could not satisfy the debt through other means, the ranch would go to cover it, and the sale would proceed as written. 60 days, not 90, and 12 of them already gone. Garrett looked at the paper. He looked at Willa. She was looking at the paper too, with the same sharp attention she had brought to everything else, and he could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. Not panic, but something more precise than that. Assessment. The same thing he was doing was, if the ranch sold before the 90 days expired, her right to remain was void. There would be no property to remain at. She would have no claim and no recourse and nowhere to go in a town that did not know her and had no particular reason to care. And Garrett would have nothing left of what his brother had built, whatever its flaws, whatever its burdens. It was still the only thing Caleb had left in the world, and it was still a Hart ranch. And that meant something even if he could not easily have said what. He asked Pruitt if there was any room in the arrangement to negotiate the timeline. Pruitt said that Mrs. Fuller's lawyers had been very clear on that point. He asked if there was any mechanism by which the debt could be settled without the sale. Pruitt looked at his papers and said that in theory, yes. If someone were to take on the debt directly and make arrangements to service it, the sale could be deferred indefinitely. But the debt was not a small amount, and assuming that obligation would require someone willing to do so. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. He picked up his hat from the table where he had set it and turned it once in his hands, which was something he did when he was working through a problem and needed his hands occupied while his mind moved. Then he set the hat back down and said he needed to see all the papers, every document, every figure. He wanted to understand the full picture before he made any decisions. Pruitt nodded and began to gather things from the various stacks on his desk. Garrett looked across the table at Willa Voss. She was watching him again with that quiet, steady attention. She had not asked for anything. She had not appealed or argued or tried to soften the situation with words. She had simply sat there and listened and read what was put in front of her, and she was still doing it now. He said, "You have somewhere to stay tonight." It was not quite a question. She said, "I'll manage." He said, "There's a room at the ranch. It has a lock." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked down at her canvas bag on the floor beside her chair. One bag, 11 days of travel. A man she had never met, gone before she arrived. A contract that gave her 90 days, and a debt that threatened to erase them. She picked up the bag. She said, "All right." They did not speak much on the ride out to the ranch. The road ran west through scrub grass and low hills, and the late afternoon light came across the valley in long flat bands that turned everything gold and rust, and the particular deep amber of old wood. Garrett drove the wagon, and Willa sat beside him with her bag in her lap and watched the landscape open up around them, wider and stranger and more spare than anything she had known before. At one point she asked how far it was. He said about half an hour. After that, the silence returned, and neither of them pushed against it. There was something almost restful in it, though Willa could not have said why. She had spent 11 days on a stagecoach, surrounded by strangers whose voices filled every available space, and the quiet of this road and this man beside her felt like setting down something heavy she had been carrying for a long time. The ranch appeared around a low hill, a main house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, a fence line that ran out toward the edge of a flat pasture, where a handful of cattle stood motionless in the fading light. It was not prosperous. That was clear from the distance. The fence needed work in several places, and the barn door hung at a slight angle that suggested the hinge had been meaning to give way for some time. But it was solid. The bones of it were good, and someone, at some point, had cared enough to build things that would last. Garrett brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down and came around to her side without being asked. He did not offer his hand. He simply stood where she could use him for balance if she needed to, and moved back when she didn't. She carried her own bag. He showed her the room without ceremony. It was small and plain and clean, with a window that looked out toward the barn and a hook on the back of the door where a key hung on a short leather cord. He told her there was a well around the east side of the house, and that supper was whatever she could find in the kitchen, because he had not had time to properly provision the place since he arrived, and that she was welcome to whatever was there. Then he went back out to the wagon to bring in his own things. Willa stood in the small plain room and listened to his footsteps move away across the porch, and then she walked to the door and took the key from the hook and turned the lock from the inside. The click of it was quiet and final and entirely satisfying. She set her bag on the bed and sat down beside it and looked at the window and the last of the evening light coming through it. Somewhere in this house there was a dead man's debt and a contract with a woman's name on it and a stack of papers that had not yet finished telling all the things they had to say. Somewhere outside there was a stranger who had offered her a room with a lock because he understood, without being told, that this was the first thing a woman needed before she could think about anything else. 90 days. 60 days. and 12 of those already spent. A ranch that might not exist by the time either timeline ran out. She reached into her bag and found the folded papers she had carried with her since leaving home. The letters Caleb had written her, 3 of them, the last one arriving only 2 weeks before she departed. She had read them enough times that she could have recited them without looking. She did not take them out now. She only rested her hand on top of them for a moment through the fabric of the bag, the way you rest your hand on something you are not ready to put away. Then she stood up, smoothed her skirt, and went to see what was in the kitchen. Whatever came next, she would need to eat. And then she would need to think. And thinking had always been something she could do, regardless of what else had been taken from her. She had arrived in Harlow Creek with nothing but a canvas bag and a name that meant nothing to anyone here. She intended to leave with considerably more than that. Or she intended to earn the right to stay. Either way, she was not going to wait for someone else to decide it for her. The first morning at the ranch, Willa was awake before the light came. She had always been an early riser, but this was something different from habit. She lay in the narrow bed in the small plain room and listened to the sounds of a place that was not yet familiar. The particular creak of the house settling in the pre-dawn cool, the distant movement of cattle somewhere beyond the barn, the wind coming low across the flat pasture and finding every gap in the window frame. Different sounds than she had known. Not unpleasant, just foreign in the way that all new places are foreign before you have lived in them long enough to stop noticing. She dressed in the dark and went to the kitchen. Garrett was not yet up. The house held the specific stillness of a place where only one person is awake, and Willa moved through it quietly, taking stock of what was there. The kitchen was functional and almost entirely without comfort. A cast iron stove, a work table, a shelf with a modest collection of dry goods that had been there long enough to suggest no one had cooked a proper meal in some time. There was coffee, at least. She found the pot and the grounds and set water to heat on the stove. And while she waited, she opened the narrow door beside the window that led to a small back room and found what she had half expected to find. The ranch's account books, 3 of them, stacked on a low shelf beside a broken bridle and 2 empty feed sacks. They had not been put there with any sense of organization. They had simply been set there in the way that things get set somewhere when no one wants to deal with them but cannot quite bring themselves to throw them away. Willa took the top one and brought it to the kitchen table. She had learned bookkeeping from her father, who had spent the better part of his working life as a clerk in a legal office, and believed, with quiet intensity, that a woman who could read a column of figures was a woman who could not easily be cheated. He had taught her the way he taught her everything, without ceremony, simply by sitting beside her and showing her, and then expecting her to do it herself. She had taken to it with the same instinct she brought to most tasks that required precision and patience. Numbers behaved. Numbers said what they meant. In a life that had not always offered that particular courtesy, she had found it something close to comforting. She opened the account book and began to read. By the time Garrett came into the kitchen, she had been at it for the better part of an hour, and the coffee had long since finished brewing. She had set a second cup beside the pot without thinking about it, in the automatic way of someone who has lived with other people and absorbed the habit of consideration without making a conscious decision to do so. He stopped when he saw her at the table. He looked at the account book open in front of her. He looked at the second cup beside the coffee pot. He did not say anything about either of these things. He poured himself the coffee and sat down at the far end of the table and waited. She said, There is a payment recorded in the second quarter of last year that appears twice, once in the main ledger and once in this one, listed under different headings but going to the same creditor. The amounts match exactly. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how much? She told him. It was not a small number, but it was not the largest problem in the ledger either. It was, however, a problem that could be addressed, which made it different in kind from some of the others. Garrett looked at his coffee cup. He looked at the window, where the early light was beginning to come across the pasture in the flat gray way of dawn before the color arrives. Then he looked at her, and it was a different kind of looking than the previous day, not guarded exactly, but more direct. The look of someone revising a calculation. He said, "You can read those." It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It landed somewhere between the two. She said, "My father was a legal clerk for most of his life. He thought it was important." She paused. He was right. Garrett nodded once, slowly, the way he seemed to do most things, without hurry, without performance. Then he pulled the account book toward him and looked at the entries she had indicated, and after a few minutes, he pushed it back without comment. But he did not tell her to put it away. And that, Willa understood, was its own kind of answer. The days settled into a shape. It was not a comfortable shape, not at first. They were two strangers in a house that belonged to neither of them, navigating the ordinary mechanics of shared space with the careful attention of people who know that small frictions can become large ones if left unaddressed. They were courteous. They were, in their separate ways, competent. And they were both, Willa suspected, more accustomed to managing alone than they would readily admit. Garrett spent his days outside, working the fence line, tending the cattle, assessing the various things that needed repair, and addressing them in the systematic way of someone who finds physical work easier than most other kinds. He was quiet in the way of people for whom silence is a considered choice rather than a lack of something to say. He did not explain himself. He did not offer information about himself unless directly asked. And even then, his answers tended toward the brief end of the scale. Willa spent her days differently. She had no official role here, no claim on the work beyond the 90 days the contract allowed her, and she was acutely aware of that fact. She did not pretend otherwise, but she also could not simply sit in a room and wait for time to pass, because that was not something her nature permitted. She cooked because there was food that needed cooking, and she was good at it. She cleaned because the house had been without consistent care for some time, and the neglect showed. And she continued reading the account books, because once she had started, she could not make herself stop, and because what she found in them mattered in ways that went beyond her own situation. The double payment she had found on the first morning was not the only irregularity. There were others, smaller, subtler, the kind of errors that accumulate when someone manages money without sufficient education in the managing of it. Caleb, from everything the ledger suggested, had not been a dishonest man. He had simply been a man who did not fully understand what he was signing or what the figures in front of him meant, and who had trusted that the people he dealt with were operating in good faith. Some of them had not been. On the fourth day, Willa found the entry for the loan. She sat with it for a long time before she said anything to Garrett. She read it 3 times, carefully, making sure she understood the structure of it before she tried to explain it to anyone else. Then she read it a 4th time, because the implications of what she was reading were significant enough to warrant that kind of certainty. The loan had been made by Dorla Fuller. The principal amount was substantial but not unreasonable for a ranch operation of this size, What was not immediately obvious, buried in the language of the repayment schedule in a way that required careful attention to see, was the interest structure. For the first period, the rate was modest. But after a specific triggering condition, one that could be reached without great difficulty, and that Caleb had clearly not recognized as the threshold it was, the rate increased, significantly, in a way that made the original loan amount almost irrelevant to the total obligation that had accrued by the time of his death. It was not an accident. The language was too precise for accident. Someone had constructed this document with the specific intention of making it appear straightforward on first reading while concealing its true cost in the details. And Caleb, who had never been a details man, had signed it. She brought it to Garrett that evening. He read it at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and his coffee gone cold at his elbow, and she watched his face while he read, because she had learned that his face was where the truth of what he was thinking showed up, even when his words did not. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved carefully through the document, line by line, in the way of someone making sure they have not misunderstood before they allow themselves a reaction. When he finished, he set the paper down and looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, "She wrote this to trap him," Willa said. "Yes." He looked up. "You're certain?" She said, "I have read a great many legal documents. My father made sure of that. This one was written by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and did it deliberately." She paused. Caleb would not have seen it. Most people wouldn't. Garrett was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with the low, persistent sound that had become, in 4 days, something almost familiar to her. The lamp flame bent slightly in a draft from the window and steadied again. He said, "This is why she wants the ranch." "It was not a question," Willa said. "The debt as structured gives her the right to call it in under circumstances that are very easy for her to create and very difficult for anyone else to prevent. The sale contract follows from that. She built the whole thing so that the sale would look like the natural consequence of a debt that couldn't be paid, rather than a taking." Garrett looked at her. There was something in his expression that was not quite respect and not quite surprise, but occupied the space between them where those two things meet. He said, "How long did it take you to see all that?" She said, 2 days for the loan structure, 1 more to be sure." He nodded. He picked up the paper and looked at it again, not reading now, just holding it. Then he set it face down on the table, as if the text itself was something he did not want to look at any longer than necessary. He said, "Thank you." It was the first time he had said those words to her. She noticed and did not make anything of it, and simply said, "There may be more. I haven't finished the 3rd ledger." He said, "Take your time." It was the closest thing to warmth he had yet offered, and she accepted it in the spirit in which it was given, quietly, without inflation, as the thing it was, and nothing more. Harlow Creek was a small town, and small towns ran on observation the way other places ran on water or trade. Within the first week, the fact of Willa's presence at the Hart Ranch was known to most of the people who made it their business to know such things, which in Harlow Creek was most of the people. The reactions were various. Some were sympathetic. A woman come all that way to find the man gone. No one could begrudge her a roof while things were sorted out. Some were curious in the pointed, speculative way of people for whom other people's circumstances provide a welcome diversion from their own. And some were less charitable, offering the particular variety of small-town judgment that concerns itself with what is proper and who belongs where, and whether the arrangement between a single woman and a single man in a house without a chaperone was the sort of thing that should be allowed to continue. Willa heard some of this when she came into town for provisions on the 5th day. She heard it in the slight pause before the woman at the dry goods counter responded to her greeting. She heard it in the way a conversation near the entrance to the post office stopped entirely when she walked past and resumed at a lower volume once she had gone by. She heard it, and she noted it, and she filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept the things that were true, and that she would need to account for eventually. And then she continued with what she had come to do. She was at the mercantile counter tallying her purchases when Dorla Fuller walked in. Willa recognized her from the description Garrett had given. A tall woman, late 50s, dressed with the careful precision of someone who understood that appearance was its own form of leverage. Her hair was silver and arranged without a strand out of place. Her expression was the expression of a person who has been comfortable for long enough that discomfort in others reads to them as a kind of disorder. She looked at Willa with the specific quality of attention that power gives itself permission to use, assessing, unhurried, entirely unconcerned about being seen to assess. She said, "You must be the woman from the Hart place." Willa said she was. Mrs. Fuller said that she had heard about the situation and that she thought it was very unfortunate, the whole business, and that she hoped things would be resolved in a way that was satisfactory for everyone involved. She said this with the practiced smoothness of someone who has said similar things many times and knows exactly how much they mean. Willa looked at her and said that she hoped so too. She said it pleasantly, without edge, and turned back to her purchases. She felt Mrs. Fuller's eyes on her back for a moment before the woman moved on to whatever she had actually come in for. And she stood at the counter and kept her hands steady and her face composed. And she thought about the loan document she had read by lamplight the night before, and the very precise language it contained. And she thought about a man who had trusted people. He should not have trusted, and had paid for that trust with everything he had. She did not let any of this show, but she remembered it. She remembered all of it. That evening she found something she had not been looking for. She had gone back to the small back room to return the 3rd ledger to the shelf, and in doing so, she moved the broken bridle that had been sitting on top of a wooden box she had not noticed before. The box was not locked. Inside it were papers, not account records, but personal correspondence, letters received, and letters started but not finished. The accumulated written life of a man who had not thrown things away. She did not read them. They were not hers to read. But on the top of the pile, she saw an envelope with her name on it. Her name, in handwriting she recognized from the 3 letters he had sent her during the months of their arrangement. Willa Voss, it said. And beneath her name, in smaller letters, when she arrives. She stood with the envelope in her hands for a long moment. Then she took it to her room, and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she opened it. She read it once, all the way through, without stopping. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope and set it on the table beside the bed where the lamp was. She sat for a while longer, her hands in her lap, looking at the envelope without seeing it. Whatever she had expected to feel reading those words, this was something different. Not grief, exactly. Not relief. Something more complicated than either. The particular feeling of receiving something that was genuinely meant from someone who was no longer there to know that it had reached you. She did not tell Garrett about the letter, not that night, and not in the days that followed. It was not his to know, at least not yet. Some things needed to be carried alone for a while before they could be shared, and she had learned, over the years, to be honest with herself about which things were which. What she carried instead into the days that followed was something that surprised her a little by its presence. Garrett had begun, without comment or explanation, to leave a second cup beside the coffee pot each morning. It was a small thing, an entirely practical thing, one might argue. He knew she woke early and drank coffee in the mornings, and setting out an extra cup cost nothing and saved a step. She told herself this on the first morning she noticed it, and on the second. By the third morning, she had stopped telling herself anything about it and simply accepted it as one of the unremarkable facts of the household. The way she accepted the sound of the wind and the angle of the morning light through the kitchen window. She did not comment on it, neither did he. But she began, in the evenings, to leave the lamp in the kitchen burning when she went to her room, because he came in late sometimes, after the evening chores, and a dark house was an unwelcoming thing to come into, and there was no reason it needed to be dark if she was awake anyway, and the oil was sufficient. He did not comment on this either. They were building something, though neither of them would have used that word. It was too early for that word, and they were both too careful with language to apply it prematurely. But there was a structure taking shape in the ordinary hours of the day, in the second cup, and the burning lamp, and the way he had started angling the account book toward her when he spread papers on the kitchen table, without being asked, because he had learned that she would look at it regardless. And there was no point in making her lean. On the evening of the 8th day, Garrett came in from outside later than usual. He had been to town. She had heard the wagon go out in the afternoon. And he came back with the particular set to his jaw that she had come to recognize as the outer expression of something he was working through internally. He sat down at the kitchen table and took off his hat and set it down and said, "Fuller's lawyers sent another letter. They want to schedule a formal review of the estate 2 weeks from now." Willa sat down across from him. She said, "What does that mean for the timeline?" He said it meant the 60 days was real and they intended to hold to it, which left fewer than 40. She was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she said, "There are things in the third ledger that Pruitt may not have seen. The way the loan is structured, there are grounds to question whether the debt is as settled as Fuller's lawyers are presenting it." He looked at her. "What kind of grounds?" she said. "The kind that requires someone who knows what they're looking at." She paused. "I know what I'm looking at." He held her gaze for a moment. Outside, a nightbird called once and went quiet. He said, "Then I'd like you to look." She nodded. She pulled the third ledger from where she had left it at the end of the table and opened it to the pages she had been studying earlier in the week. And Garrett poured himself coffee and leaned forward with his elbows on the table and listened while she explained what she had found. And the lamp burned between them, and the night settled in around the house. And somewhere in the middle of it all, without either of them quite marking the moment it happened, they stopped being strangers. Then the morning of the 10th day arrived, and with it something Willa had not expected. She came into the kitchen to find a piece of paper on the table, not from the account books, but a separate sheet, folded once. She opened it. It was a note from Garrett, left before he went out, in the plain, direct handwriting of a man who writes what he means, and nothing more. It said, "Fuller came by the ranch last evening while you were in your room. I didn't tell you last night, because I didn't want you to lose sleep over it. She wasn't here to talk to me. She asked for you. I told her you weren't available. She said to tell you that she hoped you were thinking carefully about your situation." Willa read the note twice. She set it back down on the table. She poured her coffee. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the flat pasture where the morning light was just beginning to arrive, and she thought about a woman who had built a trap out of legal language and patience and the reasonable assumption that the people she dealt with would not know what they were looking at. Willa set down her cup. She thought, that assumption was the first mistake. She went to the back room and took the third ledger from the shelf, and she carried it to the kitchen table, and she sat down, and she opened it to the beginning, and she started again from the first page, because there was something in the structure of that loan that she had not yet fully worked out, something at the edges of what she had seen so far, and she was going to find it. She was going to find it because it was there to be found, and because the alternative was to let a carefully constructed wrong stand simply because no one had bothered to read closely enough. Her father had given her that. The reading, the patience for it, the refusal to be confused by language that was designed to confuse. She was not going to waste it. It was on the 11th day that Willa found what she had been looking for. She had gone back to the beginning of the third ledger, as she had decided that morning over her coffee, and worked through it with the methodical patience her father had taught her, not skimming, not assuming, but reading each entry the way you read something that is trying to hide itself, which is to say, slowly and with suspicion toward anything that appears too clean. The triggering condition was buried in the fourth quarter records. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It was a single entry, recorded in Caleb's hand with the casual brevity of a man who did not understand the weight of what he was writing down. A payment made to a supplier that, when cross-referenced against the loan document from Dorla Fuller, met the precise threshold that caused the interest rate to change. Caleb had made that payment without knowing what it meant. He had simply paid a bill the way he paid other bills, and in doing so had tripped a mechanism he did not know existed, and the debt had restructured itself around him without his awareness. What Willa saw, sitting with both documents open on the kitchen table, was something else. The payment had been made on a date that, according to a separate receipt she found pressed between 2 pages of the ledger, had been arranged by a representative of Fuller's own operation. The supplier was connected to Fuller's holdings. Caleb had not chosen to make that payment independently. It had been steered to him. The invoice presented, the timing managed, the trigger pulled by someone else's hand while Caleb's name went on the record. She sat with this for a long time. Then she took a clean sheet of paper and began to write it out in sequence, the way her father had taught her to lay out a complex argument, not in the language of accusation, but in the language of fact. This happened, then this, then this. Here is the document that shows it. Here is the date. Here is the name. When Garrett came in for the midday meal, she was still writing. He looked at the papers spread across the table. He looked at her face. He sat down across from her and waited. She said, "She arranged the trigger herself. The payment that changed the loan terms. It came through one of her own suppliers." Caleb didn't stumble into the threshold. He was walked into it. Garrett was very still. "You can show that. I can show the connection between the supplier and her holdings. I can show the timing. I can show that the invoice came through channels that trace back to her." She paused. "It is not a confession, but it is a pattern, and patterns have a way of speaking clearly to anyone willing to read them." He looked at the papers on the table. His expression was the particular tension of a man confronting something that confirms what he already suspected, and finds the confirmation worse than the suspicion. He said, "Caleb never saw any of this." "It was not a question." Willa said, "No." He wouldn't have known where to look. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said more quietly, "He wasn't a stupid man. He trusted that the world operated the way he thought it did, that people said what they meant." He stopped. He was wrong about that more often than he should have been. There was something in his voice that was not quite grief and not quite frustration, but lived in the house where those two things share a wall. Willa did not try to fill it with reassurance. She let it sit, because some things deserve to sit, and she was beginning to understand that Garrett was a man who needed room for his silences the way some people need room to speak. After a while he said, "What do we do with this?" She said, "We keep looking. There may be more. And we think about who might be in a position to act on it." He nodded. He reached across the table and turned one of the documents toward him and read it with the focused attention he brought to everything practical. She watched him read and thought that this, the two of them at this table, with these papers between them, was perhaps the most honest thing she had experienced in a very long time. That evening the weather changed. A front came through from the north in the late afternoon, dropping the temperature with the abruptness that the open country permitted. And by the time Garrett came in from outside, the sky had gone the particular dark gray of a serious evening, and the wind was moving through the grass in long, cold waves. Willa had built up the fire in the main room, more out of instinct than calculation. And when Garrett came through the door and stopped in the warmth of it, she saw something in his posture ease slightly. A small release, barely visible, the kind of thing you only notice if you have been paying attention. He sat in the chair nearest the fire. She was in the other one, with the third ledger closed on her lap, because she had reached the point where looking at it further that day would produce diminishing returns. The fire moved between them, quiet and steady. After a while he said, "How long were you in the town you came from?" She said, "All my life until this year." He said, "And before the arrangement with Caleb, what were you doing?" She said, "Working in the legal office where my father worked. After he became too ill to continue, I managed the correspondence and records on my own for a time." She paused. "When he died, the position went to someone else, someone the senior partner preferred." She said this without bitterness, because the bitterness had been, and she had moved through it. I was not in a position to argue. He said, "So you wrote to Caleb?" She said, "I answered the advertisement. It was not the only one I considered, but his letters were." She thought about how to say it accurately. He wrote like a man who was trying to be honest about what he was and wasn't, which is rarer than it should be. Garrett looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said, "He was honest. That much is true. He was honest, and he was not particularly careful, and those two things together got him into more trouble than either would have alone." Willa said, "Tell me about him." She said it simply, without apology for asking, because she had decided sometime in the past several days that directness was the most respectful approach with this man, and the one he seemed to respond to best. Garrett was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "He was 4 years older than me. He came out here first. I followed later, after things changed at home." He paused, and she did not ask what things, because the way he said it was enough to understand that it was its own territory, and she had not yet been invited into it. He was better with people than I am. Always was. He could talk to anyone and make them feel like they were the most interesting person in the room, which sounds like a small gift, but it isn't. when you think about it. It matters to people being seen that way. He stopped again. The trouble was that he had the same quality with people who didn't deserve it. He gave everyone the same good faith, and he couldn't always tell when it was being used against him. Willa said, like Mrs. Fuller. He said, like a great many people over the years. But yes, her especially. The fire settled with a soft sound. Outside, the night had come on fully now, and the cold pressed at the window with quiet persistence. She said, he wrote to me about the ranch, in his letters. He said it was the thing he was most proud of. Garrett looked at her, and something in his expression shifted in a way she had not seen before. Not surprise, exactly. Something more careful than that. He said, he wrote to you about it. She said, several times. He described the pasture in the morning and the way the light came across it. He said... She paused, deciding how much to give. He said it was the only place he had ever lived where he felt like the land was on his side. Garrett turned back to the fire. A long moment passed. He said, that sounds like him. There was a quality to his voice when he said it that she understood was not for her. It was for Caleb, for the version of his brother who had written letters to a woman he had never met, and tried to describe the morning light on a pasture because he wanted someone to understand why it mattered. She did not intrude on it. They sat in the firelight for a while longer, and then Willa said the thing she had been carrying since the 11th day. Not all of it, but the part that was his to know. She said, there is something I should tell you, about a letter I found. He looked at her. She said, Caleb left a letter for me, unsealed, in a box with his other papers. I found it the first week. She kept her voice level. He wrote it before he was ill, before any of this. He told me... She stopped and then continued carefully. He told me that he had a debt he was not sure he could manage and that he was trying to find a solution. He said he hoped that whoever came would be someone who could see the ranch for what it was worth, not just in money. And he said he was sorry, in advance, for whatever complications might be waiting when she arrived. Garrett had gone very still. She said, he knew it was a harder situation than he had presented it. He knew, at least in part, what he was asking someone to walk into. I don't know if that makes it better or worse. She paused. I thought you should know that he was not entirely without awareness. He didn't do this casually. Garrett looked at the fire for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful in the way of someone choosing each word with full attention. He said, he should have told you before you came. She said, yes. He said, that was not fair to you. She said, no. But I'm beginning to think he was also hoping that whoever came would be capable of handling it. And he wrote that in the letter, too, at the end. He said he hoped she had a strong enough mind for what was waiting and a patient enough heart for the rest. The fire moved. The cold pressed at the window. Garrett was looking at her now, and the quality of his attention was different from anything she had experienced from him before. Not the assessing look of the first days, not the careful watchfulness of the week that followed, but something more direct than either. Something that did not look away. He said, he wasn't wrong. She held his gaze for a moment and then looked at the fire, because some things need looking away from in order to be properly held. That was the night the shape of things between them changed, not dramatically, not with declaration. It changed the way the temperature had changed that evening. Through accumulation, through the gradual arrival of something that had been approaching for days, becoming present without announcement. In the mornings that followed, Garrett began to do something he had not done before. When he came in from the early chores and poured his coffee, he did not take it to the other end of the table. He pulled out the chair across from wherever Willa was sitting and sat there instead. He did not explain this. She did not comment on it. But the distance that had been a feature of every meal for the first 10 days was simply gone, replaced by a proximity that felt, to her considerable surprise, entirely natural. She told him, over several evenings, about her father. Not the summary version she had given early on, but the actual version. The specific memory of sitting beside him at his desk on winter afternoons while he walked her through the logic of a contract, the way he believed that clarity was a form of kindness, and that obscuring information from someone was a form of disrespect, regardless of the reason. She told him about the years after her mother died, when it had been just the two of them and the work and the books he brought home from the office, and how those years had shaped her in ways she had not fully understood until she was old enough to look back at them. Garrett listened in the way he did everything, completely, without the restless quality of someone waiting for their turn to speak. And then, gradually, across those same evenings, he offered things in return. He told her about the ranch he had built on the far side of the valley, how he had come to this country after his father's land in the east had been lost to debt. A different debt from Caleb's, an older story, but with certain structural similarities that were not lost on either of them as he described it. He had arrived with enough to start small and the intention of building steadily, which was what he had done, year by year, without rush and without shortcuts. Because he had watched shortcuts cost his family everything, and he had decided that patience was the closest thing to safety that the world reliably offered. She asked one evening about what had happened to make him the kind of man who lived alone and preferred it. He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had asked past the edge of what he was willing to share. Then he said, "There was a woman, before all of this, before I came out here." He stopped. "She didn't leave. I want to be clear about that. She died, fever, in the second winter after we married." He said it plainly, without dramatizing it, in the tone of a man who has carried a thing long enough that the carrying has become simply part of how he moves. I had been out on the range when she went. I came back to a house that was different from the one I had left, and it stayed different. And eventually, I understood that I was not going to be able to make it the same again by staying in it. Willa said, "So you left?" He said, "I left. I built something else, smaller, quieter." A pause. "It suited me," she said, "and now." He looked at her. The lamp was between them on the table, and the light of it fell across the planes of his face in a way that showed, for a moment, more than his expression usually permitted. The tiredness in it, and beneath the tiredness, something that was not tiredness at all. He said, "Now I'm not sure smaller and quieter is the whole answer. I thought it was for a long time." He looked away. "I may have been wrong about that." She did not press him further. She understood that this was as far as he could go in one evening, and that pushing past the edge of what someone can give is not generosity, but its opposite. What she did, after a moment, was reach across the table and turn the lamp wick down slightly, because it had been burning bright, and the softer light was easier. And it was a thing she could do without words that communicated something she did not yet have the right to say directly. He looked at the lamp. Then he looked at her. He did not say anything, but he did not look away. On the 14th day, Willa received a visitor. She was alone at the ranch. Garrett had gone to the far end of the property to address a section of fence that had been failing, when the sound of a horse brought her to the window. A rider she did not recognize dismounted at the gate. He was a young man, carrying an envelope with the careful handling of someone who has been told it is important. He said it was from Mrs. Fuller. He said he had been asked to deliver it personally. Willa thanked him and took the envelope and waited until he had ridden away before she opened it. The letter inside was brief and written in the precise, unhurried hand of a woman who was comfortable with her own authority. It said that Mrs. Fuller was aware that Willa had been reviewing the ranch accounts. It said that this was understandable, given the circumstances, but that it would not change the fundamental situation. It said that the estate was what it was, and that the legal process would proceed on its established timeline, and that Willa would be well advised to begin thinking about her plans for when the 90 days concluded, because the probability that she would still be at the ranch by that time was, in Mrs. Fuller's considered estimation, quite low. And then, in the final paragraph, written with the same even hand as everything that preceded it, she hoped that Willa would make a practical decision rather than a stubborn one. She said that she had, over the years, seen a great many people exhaust themselves fighting outcomes that were already determined. She said it was always sad to watch. She said she was offering Willa the opportunity to avoid that particular sadness by simply being realistic about what was possible and what was not. Willa read the letter once. Then she folded it and set it on the table beside the ledger she had been working through that morning. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened the ledger and picked up her pen and went back to work, because the letter had told her something Mrs. Fuller had not intended to tell her. A woman who was entirely certain of her position did not take the time to write letters like this. A woman who was entirely certain did not need to encourage her opponent towards surrender. Mrs. Fuller was not as certain as she wished to appear. And that, Willa understood, was the most useful thing she had learned all week. She did not tell Garrett about the letter that evening, not because she was keeping it from him, but because she wanted to think through what it meant before she spoke it aloud, and because she had learned, over these 2 weeks, that thinking was sometimes faster when it happened in the quiet of her own mind before it became a conversation. She left the lamp burning when she went to her room. In the morning, she would tell him. In the morning, there would be more to say, because she was very close now to understanding the full shape of what Dorla Fuller had built, and understanding the full shape of something was the first step toward finding where it was weak. She was close. She could feel it the way her father had taught her to feel the end of a complex argument, not with excitement, but with the quiet certainty of approaching solid ground. She blew out the lamp in her room and lay in the dark and listened to the cold settling in outside and thought. And somewhere in the thinking, without her quite noticing the moment it happened, she fell asleep. The morning Willa had planned to tell Garrett about the letter, she came into the kitchen and found him already at the table with papers spread before him that were not the account ledgers. She recognized the format before she recognized the content. Legal documents had a particular look: the formal spacing, the dense language, the signatures at the bottom with their witnesses listed beside them. She had grown up around enough of them to know the shape before she could read the words. She poured her coffee and sat down and looked at his face first, because his face would tell her what the papers said faster than reading them herself. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the documents, but not moving, which meant he had already read them and was now simply sitting with what they contained. She said, "What is it?" He said, "Pruitt sent these over last night after you had gone to bed. He didn't want to wait until morning." He pushed the papers toward her. Fuller's lawyers filed a motion to accelerate the settlement. They're arguing that the estate is at risk of further deterioration, and that delay serves no one's interests but the occupants." He paused on that word in a way that made clear he understood exactly how it had been chosen. If the motion is accepted, the review timeline moves up. We'd have less than 3 weeks. Willa read through the filing carefully, the way she read everything, without rushing, without letting the urgency that was pressing at the edges of the situation alter the quality of her attention. The language was precise, and the argument was constructed with skill. Whoever had written it understood what they were doing. They had framed the acceleration as a protection of the estate's value, a reasonable administrative measure, the kind of thing that would look entirely sensible to anyone who did not know the underlying situation. She set the papers down. She said, "This was written in response to something. She knows we've been going through the ledgers. The letter she sent me..." She stopped and looked at him. "She sent me a letter 2 days ago. I was going to tell you this morning. I waited because I wanted to think through what it meant first." He looked at her steadily. She could not tell from his expression whether he was troubled by the delay or simply absorbing the information. She told him what the letter had said. She told him her interpretation of it, that a woman entirely confident in her position did not write letters encouraging surrender, that the letter had read to her as the action of someone managing uncertainty rather than someone at ease. She told him she believed they were closer to a viable argument than Fuller wanted them to be, and that this filing was a response to that proximity. Garrett listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You should have told me about the letter when it arrived." She said, "Yes, I should have." He did not say anything further on that point. He was not a man who required extended acknowledgement of something once it had been given, and she respected that about him. He said, "What do you need to finish what you're building?" She said, "Time, and possibly access to records that are not in these ledgers. Specifically, anything that documents the relationship between Fuller's operation and the supplier who sent Caleb the invoice that triggered the rate change. If that connection can be established through external documentation rather than just inference from the ledger entries, the argument becomes considerably harder to dismiss." He said, "Where would that documentation be?" She said, "Pruitt may have some of it. He handled a number of transactions in this valley over the years. He may have records he doesn't know are relevant." She paused. "And there is one other possibility. The supplier himself. If he kept records of who directed the invoice to Caleb, and if those records still exist, that is the most direct evidence available." Garrett nodded slowly. He looked at the legal filing on the table. Then he picked it up and held it for a moment and set it back down. He said, "I'll go see Pruitt today, and I'll find out where the supplier operates now." She said, "I'll keep working through what we have." He stood up and took his hat from the hook by the door. He paused with his hand on the door frame and looked back at her, and she saw in his face the particular quality of a man who is about to say something that sits near the edge of what he usually permits himself. He said, "You are very good at this." Then he went out, and the door closed behind him. And Willa sat at the kitchen table with the legal filing and her coffee and the morning light coming through the window, and she held that sentence for a moment before she let herself set it aside and go back to work. She did not see Garrett again until evening. He came back later than she had expected, and she knew from the way he crossed the porch, the deliberateness of it, the extra moment before he came through the door, that something had shifted in the day's events. She had kept supper warm on the back of the stove, and she set it on the table without comment and let him sit and let the silence be whatever it needed to be until he was ready. He ate without speaking for a while. She did not press him. Then he said, "Pruitt had records. Some of what you suspected is in there. Not all of it, but enough to establish the connection between Fuller's operation and the supplier. He didn't know what he had. He'd filed it under a different heading and hadn't looked at it since." Willa said, "That's enough to work with." He said, "There's more." She looked at him. He said, "Pruitt told me something else. Something he said he'd been uncertain whether to share, but that he thought we had a right to know." He was looking at the table. Caleb came to see him about 6 weeks before he died. He came to ask about the loan, whether there was any way to challenge the terms, any argument that could be made about how the trigger had been reached. He stopped. Pruitt told him there might be grounds, but that it would require documentation he didn't have and someone with the knowledge to interpret it. He looked up at her. Caleb asked him if he knew anyone like that. The quiet in the kitchen was the kind that has weight to it. Willa said, "He wrote to me shortly after that." Garrett said, "Yes." She understood then, fully and without ambiguity, what the letter in the box had been. Not a romantic arrangement undertaken in hope, not even primarily a practical one, though it was that too. It had been a deliberate act by a man who had understood, at least in part, what he was doing and what he was asking, who had read the advertisement she had placed after her father's legal office closed, had seen in the description of her experience something he needed, and had reached toward it in the only form that made sense within the constraints of his world and hers. He had not told her. He had written letters about the morning light on the pasture and the way the land felt like home, and those things had been true. She believed they had been true, but he had not told her the rest of it. She sat with this for a moment. It was not a simple feeling. It was not anger, though there was something in it that was adjacent to anger. It was more like the feeling of a foundation shifting slightly beneath your feet, not collapsing, but revealing itself to be different from what you had understood it to be. She said, "He should have told me." Garrett said, "Yes." She said, "He should have written to me honestly and let me decide whether to come knowing the full situation." Garrett said, "Yes, he should have." She looked at him. "You knew. Some of it." He said, "Not until Pruitt told me today. I suspected Caleb had reasons beyond the obvious. I didn't know the specifics." He paused. "I'm sorry that he didn't tell you, that he made that choice and left you to find out this way." The apology was for his brother, offered on behalf of someone who could no longer offer it himself, and it was given with the same plainness that characterized everything Garrett said, without excess and without deflection. She received it the same way. She said, "I am not going to leave." He looked at her. She said, "I want you to know that, because I think you might be wondering whether this changes things for me, whether knowing that the arrangement was partly calculated changes whether I want to continue." She paused. "It doesn't. The ranch is still worth saving. The argument we are building is still valid, and I am still the person best positioned to make it." She met his eyes. "So I'm not going to leave." Something moved across his face that she could not entirely name. He nodded once. Then he reached into his coat and set a folded document on the table. She looked at it. He said, "That is what Pruitt gave me today. The records of the supplier's transactions, including the invoice sent to Caleb and the correspondence that preceded it." He pushed it toward her. "It's yours to read. I don't have the training to know what it means. You do." She took it and opened it and began to read. He cleared the table around her without being asked, moving the supper things quietly to the side so she had room, and poured himself another coffee and sat at the far end with his own thoughts while she worked. And the evening settled around them the way evenings had settled around them for 2 weeks now. Not with comfort exactly, but with the particular ease of two people who have stopped needing to perform for each other. She read for an hour. When she finished, she set the documents down and was quiet for a moment, arranging what she had found into the right order. She said, "It is here. The correspondence. There are 2 letters from someone operating under Fuller's direction, asking the supplier to route the invoice through Caleb specifically and to do so within a particular 2-week window." She looked up. They were careful. The letters don't say why, but the timing is explicit, and the timing maps exactly onto the period before the threshold was reached. She paused. This is not inference anymore. This is documentation. Garrett looked at her steadily. She said, "We have enough. I believe we have enough to go to Fuller's lawyer directly and make the case that the loan terms were manipulated through deliberate action on her part. If the trigger was engineered, the restructured debt is not valid. And if the debt is not valid as structured, the sale contract that follows from it has no foundation." She heard her own voice as she said it, and was briefly aware of how certain she sounded, and then decided that the certainty was earned and she would not soften it. Garrett said, "Then we go tomorrow." She said, "Yes." He nodded. He looked at the documents on the table and then at her. And she saw in his face the thing she had been seeing more often in recent days. The look of a man who had been living in the landscape of his own competence for so long that encountering someone else's competence produced in him not threat, but something closer to relief. She began to gather the papers into order. He said, "Willa?" She looked up. He said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that." He stopped, started again. The ranch aside, whatever happens with Fuller and the debt and all of it, I'm glad you came here. She held his gaze. The lamp was between them, and the light of it was warm and steady, and the house was quiet around them in the way it had learned to be quiet around 2 people who had stopped fighting the quiet. She said, "So am I." She meant it in ways that were not entirely about the ranch, and she thought he understood that, and she thought the understanding was mutual, and she thought that was enough for tonight. She went to her room. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and felt the weight of tomorrow pressing at the edges of the evening, which was not an unpleasant feeling so much as a serious one. They had what they needed. She believed that. But belief was not certainty, and certainty was not outcome. And she had lived long enough to know that the distance between a valid argument and a successful one was sometimes considerable. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he had sat beside her at his desk when she was a child and put a complicated document in front of her and said, "Read it again, and this time look for what it is trying not to say." She had been doing that for 2 weeks. She had found it. Now she had to say it clearly enough that someone else could not look away from it. She slept. In the early hours, before the light came, she woke suddenly with a thought she had not had before. She lay still for a moment, making sure of it, turning it over carefully in the way of someone who is woken with an idea and needs to establish whether it survives the scrutiny of full attention or dissolves, as many early morning ideas do, into something that only seemed important in the half-dark. It survived. The loan document contained a clause she had read and noted and set aside as less significant than the other elements. A clause concerning the conditions under which the debt could be formally disputed. She had read it as a procedural detail, a formality of the kind that legal documents routinely contained. But lying in the dark now, with the supplier's correspondence fresh in her mind, she saw it differently. The clause specified that a dispute could be brought only by a party with direct legal standing in the estate. Willa had 90 days of residency under the contract, but residency was not the same as legal standing. Garrett had standing as the surviving family member managing the estate, but he had not formally assumed the role of executor. That process had been pending since his arrival. If Garrett formalized his role before they brought the argument to Fuller's lawyer, the dispute would be filed from a position of unambiguous legal standing. If they went without it, there was a procedural vulnerability that Fuller's lawyers would find and use, because they were exactly the kind of lawyers who looked for procedural vulnerabilities. She needed to tell him before they left in the morning. She lay in the dark a little longer, running through the sequence of it, making sure she had it right. Then she got up and dressed and went to the kitchen and lit the lamp and sat down at the table with the loan document and read the clause one more time. While she sat reading, she noticed something else. A single sheet of paper that had slipped from the stack Garrett had been sorting through the night before, lying near the edge of the table where it must have fallen. It was not a letter. It was a draft. His handwriting, brief and unfinished, the words stopping mid-sentence, as if the hand that held the pen had changed its mind. The heading at the top named the offices of Aldrich and Associates. The first line read, "I am prepared to transfer clear title to the property in exchange for," and then nothing. No second line. Just the blunt edge of a decision that had not been completed. She stood with it for a moment. Then she set it back exactly where she had found it and did not speak of it. But she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who reads documents for a living, what he had been considering in the dark hours of the previous night. He had been prepared to give up everything. The ranch, the debt, the last thing his brother had built, in exchange for her safe passage out of Harlow Creek. He had not sent it. That mattered. But the fact that he had written it mattered too, in a way she would carry quietly and not diminish by saying aloud. She was still sitting with the loan document when she heard his door open down the hall, and his footsteps crossed to the kitchen and his hand on the door frame as he looked in at her sitting at the table in the early lamplight. He said, "You're up early." She said, "I woke with something. Sit down. I need to show you this before we go." He came in and sat across from her without hesitation, without stopping for coffee first, because he had learned in 2 weeks that when she said she had found something, it was worth hearing immediately. She turned the loan document toward him and pointed to the clause. She explained it. He listened. She watched his face move through the understanding of it and arrive at the same conclusion she had reached. He said, "How long does it take to formalize the executor role?" She said, "Pruitt can do it this morning. It is a straightforward process. It simply needs to be done." He nodded. He looked at the clause one more time. Then he looked at her. He said, "You woke up in the night and thought of this." She said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, he said, "What would I have done without you here?" She did not answer, because the question was not quite a question and did not quite require one. She simply turned the lamp wick up slightly, because the morning was coming in through the window now, and the room was brightening. And then she stood and went to put the coffee on, because they had a great deal to do before the day was over, and they would both need it. He watched her move to the stove, and she felt him watching, and neither of them said anything further. And the morning arrived around them with the particular quality of a day that is going to matter. Pruitt's office was small and smelled of old paper and lamp oil, And it was the kind of room that had absorbed so many difficult conversations over the years that the walls themselves seemed to hold a quality of careful attention. Garrett and Willa arrived before the town had fully come awake, the street outside still gray and unhurried in the early morning, and Pruitt, to his credit, did not make them wait. The executor formalization took less than an hour. It was, as Willa had said, a straightforward process. The signing of documents that should have been signed earlier but had been deferred in the general confusion of grief and logistics that follows a sudden death. Pruitt witnessed it and recorded it and set the relevant papers in order with the efficiency of a man who understood that this particular morning had a timeline attached to it. When it was done, Garrett set down the pen and looked at the signed document for a moment. There was something in his expression that was not quite relief and not quite grief, but occupied the space where those two things intersect. The particular feeling of assuming formally what you have already been carrying informally, of letting the outside world see what the inside has already accepted. Willa said, "Now we go." Pruitt looked between them. He said, "You understand that Fuller's lawyers are experienced. They will not concede easily." Willa said, "We are not asking them to concede. We are presenting documentation and asking them to advise their client accordingly. What she decides to do with that advice is her own matter." She paused. "But the documentation is what it is, and they will know that." Pruitt looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Then he nodded and said he would accompany them, if they would have him, as Garrett's legal representative. It would establish the formal character of the meeting in a way that a private visit might not. Garrett said, "Come then." The offices of Fuller's lawyers were on the north end of the main street, in a building that was newer and better maintained than most of what surrounded it. A deliberate statement, Willa had always assumed, about the prosperity of those within. They were shown into a meeting room by a young clerk who looked uncertain about what to make of the three of them, and they waited. The lawyer who came in was a compact man of middle age named Aldrich, with the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that making other people wait established the correct hierarchy for whatever followed. He looked at Pruitt, whom he recognized, and at Garrett, whom he assessed briefly, and at Willa, at whom he looked the longest, with an expression of careful neutrality that told her he had already been informed of her presence at the ranch and had formed opinions about its significance. He sat down. He did not offer pleasantries. He said, "Mr. Hart, I understand you have formalized your role in the estate this morning." Garrett said, "That's right." Aldrich said, "And what brings you here today?" Willa set the folder of documents on the table. She did it without announcement, without preamble, the way her father had taught her to present evidence. Not with drama, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knows what they have and does not need to dress it up. She said, "We are here to present documentation relevant to the loan agreement between Caleb Hart and Mrs. Fuller, and specifically to the circumstances under which the interest rate restructuring was triggered." Aldrich looked at the folder. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. "Not much, but enough," he said. "And you are," she said. "Willa Voss. I have been reviewing the ranch accounts under the terms of the residency clause in the marriage contract." She held his gaze. "I am also the person who found what is in that folder." A pause. Then Aldrich reached across the table and opened the folder. She let him read. She did not narrate it, did not guide his attention or explain what she had found before he had the opportunity to see it himself, because she had learned from her father that the most persuasive thing a document could do was speak for itself, and that the most persuasive thing a person could do in that moment was stay quiet. Garrett sat beside her without moving. Pruitt was still. The room had the quality of held breath. Aldrich read through the supplier's correspondence first. Then he went back and read the relevant sections of the loan document alongside it, and Willa watched him make the same connection she had made, visible in the slight stilling of his eyes when the timing mapped and the implications became clear. He was a skilled lawyer, and his face gave very little away, but she had spent enough time with complicated documents to recognize the moment when someone encountered something they had not expected and was deciding what to do with it. He set the papers down. He looked at the table for a moment. He said, "Where did you obtain this correspondence?" Pruitt said, "Through legitimate access to records pertaining to transactions in which the estate was a party," Aldrich said. "And the interpretation you are placing on these documents," Willa said. "Is that the invoice which triggered the rate restructuring was routed to Caleb Hart through channels directed by your client's operation, within a specific window calculated to reach the threshold? The correspondence names the parties and specifies the timing." She paused. "I am not placing an interpretation on it. I am describing what it says." Aldrich was quiet. She said, "If the trigger was engineered, the restructured debt is not a valid consequence of Mr. Hart's independent actions. And if the debt is not valid as restructured, the sale contract that derives from it has no sound foundation." The silence in the room was the particular silence of an argument that has landed and is being reckoned with. Willa had sat in enough of her father's professional conversations at the edge of the room, listening while he worked through complex matters with difficult counterparts, to recognize this silence. It was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of a man deciding how much of what he now knew could be safely ignored, and concluding, reluctantly, that the answer was very little. Aldrich said, "I will need to review these documents and discuss the matter with my client." Willa said, "Of course." Aldrich said, "This will take time." Garrett said, "We have brought copies. The originals remain with Mr. Pruitt." He said it quietly, without edge, but with the particular firmness of a man who has made a decision and is entirely comfortable with it. Aldrich looked at him. Then he looked at Willa. Then he looked at the folder on the table. He said, "I will be in contact." They left the building and stood for a moment on the street outside, in the morning air that had warmed slightly since their arrival. Harlow Creek was going about its business around them, the dry goods store opening its shutters, a wagon coming up from the south, two women talking outside the post office, the ordinary texture of an ordinary morning. Garrett said, "Now we wait." Willa said, "Now we wait." He looked at her. There was something in his face that she had not seen before, or perhaps had seen, but not in such an uncomplicated form. A plainness to it, stripped of the careful management that he usually maintained. He looked tired and certain, and something else that she did not try to name. He said, "You were extraordinary in there." She said, "I presented what we found." He said, "The way you presented it. He stopped, and she could see him searching for the language, which was not something she often witnessed in him. He was not a man who usually struggled for words because he usually chose not to use many of them. "You were not afraid of him," she said. "He was a man sitting across a table. There was nothing to be afraid of." He said, "Most people would have been." She looked at him. She said, "You weren't." He said, "I was watching you, and I forgot to be." She held his gaze for a moment and then looked out at the street, because the morning suddenly felt like something that needed a little more space in it. They rode back to the ranch in the same quiet they had ridden out in, but it was a different quality of quiet now. Lighter, less weighted. the quiet of people who have done what they set out to do and are allowing themselves the pause between effort and outcome. The waiting was 3 days. They were not easy days exactly, but they were not terrible ones either. The work of the ranch continued because work continued regardless of what was being waited for, and Willa found that she was grateful for this, for the structure of it, the way the morning chores arrived without asking permission, the way the accounts still needed maintaining and the meals still needed making, and the fence on the south pasture that Garrett had been meaning to address still needed a morning of his attention. She had always worked better when her hands were occupied. Thinking, she had found, happened more clearly in the background of activity than it did in the foreground of enforced stillness. On the second evening, Garrett came in from the barn later than usual and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before he came in, and she looked up from the ledger she had been updating and saw something in his posture that made her put the pen down. He said, "I went out to the far pasture today, the one Caleb wrote to you about, the one with the light in the morning." She said, "Yes." He said, "I haven't been out there since I arrived. I'd been avoiding it." He looked at the door frame. It's exactly what he said it was. She did not fill the silence that followed. She let it be what it was. He came in and sat down, and she poured coffee for both of them, and they sat for a while without speaking. And outside the evening came on in the slow way of open country, the sky going through all its colors before settling finally into dark, and somewhere in the middle of it, Garrett said, "He would have liked you. I keep thinking that. He wrote to you, hoping you would be capable of handling what was waiting, and you were considerably more capable than he imagined, I think, and he would have found that." He paused. "He would have been delighted by it, actually." She said, "You sound surprised that you're saying that." He said, "I am, a little." She said, "Why?" He thought about this. He said, "Because it means I'm glad he brought you here. And for most of the time since I arrived, I've been angry with him for the position he put everyone in. And it's strange to hold both of those things at the same time." She said, "I think that is exactly what it means to grieve someone complicated." He looked at her. He said, "Is that something else your father taught you?" She said, "No, that one I learned myself." He nodded. They drank their coffee, and the dark came fully on, and the lamp between them was steady and warm. And Willa thought that this was the thing she had not expected when she had packed her single canvas bag and climbed into a stagecoach and gone toward an unknown future. Not the legal complexity, not the difficult work, not even the slow and careful business of learning a man who expressed himself primarily through action rather than language. She had not expected to find that an unknown place could begin, in the space of a few weeks, to feel like somewhere she understood. The message from Aldrich came on the morning of the third day. It was brief and written in the formal language of legal correspondence, which meant it took longer to say what it was saying than the thing itself required. But what it was saying, stripped of its formality, was this: Mrs. Fuller was prepared to discuss a resolution. Pruitt came with them to the second meeting, as he had to the first. Dorla Fuller was present this time. She sat at the head of the meeting room table in the careful way she did everything, composed, precisely arranged, giving nothing away in her posture that she did not choose to give. She looked at Willa when they entered, and the look was different from the one she had offered in the Mercantile on that early day in town. That look had been the look of a woman assessing something she did not consider a serious concern. This one was different. It was the look of a woman who had revised her assessment and was deciding how to manage the revision. Aldrich laid out the terms of the resolution with the practiced efficiency of a man who wanted to reach the end of a difficult conversation as quickly as professional courtesy permitted. Mrs. Fuller would withdraw the acceleration motion. The sale contract would be voided on the grounds that the loan terms from which it derived had been reached through irregular means. This was the language they used, irregular means, which was the legal system's way of acknowledging something without saying it directly. The debt itself would be restated at the original interest rate, without the restructuring, and a reasonable repayment schedule would be established. Garrett listened and then said, "The amount at the original rate." Aldrich named it. Garrett looked at Pruitt. Pruitt gave a small nod that meant it was manageable, which was what Garrett had asked him with the look. Garrett said, "Agreed." Fuller, who had not spoken through any of this, said, "I want it understood that I consider the interpretation placed on those documents to be," Aldrich said, "Mrs. Fuller." Quietly, but with the specific quality of a man who has advised his client on what was and was not useful to say, and is now applying that advice. She stopped. Willa looked at her across the table, not with triumph, because triumph required an adversary you had wanted to defeat, and what she had wanted was simply to correct something that was wrong. Not with satisfaction either, exactly, though there was something in the region of it, the particular feeling of an argument that has been built carefully and has held. She looked at Dorla Fuller and thought about Caleb, who had trusted a person he should not have trusted because he believed the world operated the way he thought it did, and had been wrong about that in a way that had cost him everything. She looked at her and thought about her father, who had spent his working life making sure that language said what it meant, and that the people who used it to obscure the truth did not go entirely without consequence. She looked at her and thought, the documentation was what it was, and you knew it, and that is enough. She did not say any of this. She simply sat and let the meeting conclude. And when it was done, she stood and gathered the papers that were hers and followed Garrett and Pruitt out into the street. Outside, the morning was bright and the air had the particular clearness that comes after several days of waiting for something, when the waiting is finally over and the world resumes its ordinary texture. Pruitt shook Garrett's hand and said he would have the formal paperwork drawn up and ready to sign within a few days. He looked at Willa and said, with the careful understatement of a man who chose his words deliberately, "Your father would have been proud of the work you did here." She said, "Thank you." He walked back toward his office, and then it was just Garrett and Willa on the street in the bright morning. He stood for a moment with his hat in his hands, turning it once the way he did when he was working through something. Then he put it on and looked at her. He said, "Come on, I'll take you out to the far pasture." She said, "Now?" He said, "The light is good in the mornings." Caleb was right about that. He paused. "You should see it." They rode out in the wagon on a track that curved south and then west, through country that opened gradually as they went, the scrub thinning, the grass growing longer, the hills dropping back on either side until the land lay flat and wide in every direction, and the sky above it was enormous in the way she had noticed on the very first day, that quality of vastness that made everything beneath it feel both very small and very free. The far pasture was where the track ended. Garrett pulled the wagon to a stop at the edge of it, and they sat for a moment without getting down. The morning light was coming across it from the east in the long, flat bands that she had seen from the kitchen window every day for 3 weeks. But from here, without the house and the barn and the fence line intervening, it was something different. It came across the grass in a way that made the color shift as she watched. Gold and green, and the particular amber she had no better word for. And the whole flat stretch of it moved slowly in the breeze, in long waves, the way she imagined the sea moved, though she had never seen it. She understood why Caleb had written about it. She understood what he had meant when he said it felt like the land was on his side. Garrett said, "He used to come out here in the evenings, when things were difficult. He said it helped him think." She said, "It does." He said, "Willa?" She looked at him. He had turned on the wagon seat to face her, which was not something he usually did. He tended to speak looking forward, or at the thing he was discussing, or at his hands. Facing her directly was unusual, and she understood without being told that what came next was something he had been deciding whether to say for some time. He said, "The 90 days. It ends in a few weeks." She said, "Yes." He said, "The terms of the contract give you the right to leave at that point, with fair provision, as Pruitt put it." He stopped. "I want you to know that I will make sure that provision is genuinely fair. Whatever you need to start somewhere else, or go back to where you came from, or go somewhere new entirely." He paused. "I will make sure you have it." She looked at him. She said, "Are you asking me to leave?" He said, "No." He said it immediately, without hesitation, with the particular certainty of someone who has been very clear with themselves about what they mean before they speak. "I am telling you that you are not obligated to stay, that whatever you decide, it is a free decision, that nothing you have done here, none of the work or the time or—" He stopped again. "None of it creates an obligation in you. I don't want you to stay because you feel you owe it." She said, "What do you want?" He looked at her for a long moment. The light moved across the pasture and the breeze came through the grass with its low, persistent sound. He said, "I want you to stay because you want to. If you want to." He paused. "I am aware that is a great deal to ask of someone who came here under entirely different circumstances." She said, "You are not asking. You just said the decision is mine." He said, "It is." She looked at the pasture. She looked at the light moving through the grass. She thought about the canvas bag she had carried onto the stagecoach, the single bag that had seemed, on that first day, like the whole of what she had in the world. She thought about her father's desk and the complicated documents he had put in front of her and taught her to read. She thought about the letter in the envelope on the table beside her bed, and the sentence in it that she had carried for 3 weeks like a piece of warm stone. "I hope she stays." She thought about a second cup beside the coffee pot every morning, a lamp left burning in the kitchen, a coat set on a hook by the door in a way that left room for another one beside it, though she had not noticed that until the second week. She thought about a man who had turned on a wagon seat to face her directly because what he needed to say required being looked at while he said it. She thought about a draft letter, unfinished, never sent. She said, "I am not going to leave." He looked at her. She said, "Not because of the contract, not because I have nowhere else to go. I have other options. Pruitt has made that clear, and I believe it." She held his gaze. "I'm going to stay because this place has begun to feel like something I want to be part of. Because the work here is work I am good at, and that matters. And because—" She stopped and made herself continue. Because she had decided in the first week that directness was what this man responded to, and she was not going to abandon it now, at the moment when it mattered most. Because I would like to find out what this is, between us, given the time. The silence that followed was not an uncertain one. It was the silence of something being recognized and accepted. He said, "So would I." He reached across the small distance between them on the wagon seat, and she felt his hand close over hers, rough with calluses and warm in the morning air. And they sat like that for a while, looking out at the pasture, where the light moved through the long grass in waves, and the sky above it went on, and everything was very still. After a while, they drove back to the ranch. She made coffee. He brought in wood for the stove. She opened the account ledger that needed updating, and he spread out the fence diagrams that needed review. And they sat across from each other at the kitchen table the way they had sat for weeks now, with the ordinary work of the day between them, and the light came through the window at its usual angle, and the house made its usual sounds, and nothing was dramatically different from the morning before, except that it was entirely different in the way that things are when the uncertainty beneath them has been resolved, not loudly, not with ceremony, but with the quiet permanence of a door that has been properly closed. 3 days later, Willa found something in the wooden box in the back room. She had gone to return a document she had borrowed and had moved the box to reach the shelf behind it, and it shifted in her hands in a way that suggested something was loose inside. She set it on the table and opened it, and at the very bottom, beneath all of Caleb's papers, pressed flat against the wood in a way that would have required emptying the box entirely to find, which she had not done the first time, she discovered a small flat envelope she had not seen before. On the outside, in Caleb's handwriting, "For Garrett." She carried it to him without opening it. He was at the work table in the barn, and he looked up when she came in, and saw immediately from her face that something had changed. She held out the envelope. She told him where she had found it. He took it and looked at his brother's handwriting on the front of it for a long moment. Then he set the envelope on the work table and looked at it. She said, "I'll leave you to it." She went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and waited, because some things belonged to people privately and required time. And the understanding of when to be present and when to step back was one of the things she was still learning about this man and about herself in relation to him. He was in the barn for a long time. When he came back, he sat down across from her and set the envelope on the table between them. His face had the look of a man who has been somewhere difficult and has returned, not unsteady, but changed in some way that had not fully settled yet. She waited. He said, "He wrote it after he went to see Pruitt, after he understood that things were worse than he'd known." He looked at the envelope. He apologized for the debt and for not managing things better, and for being the kind of man who found it easier to hope that things would resolve themselves than to face them directly. He paused. He said he was trying to do one thing right at the end, that he had found someone who might be able to help, and that he hoped I would. He stopped. He hoped I would give her a fair chance. Willa did not say anything. Garrett said, "He also said he was sorry for the distance between us in the last years." That was his word. Distance. He looked at the table. We were never good at finding our way back to each other after a difficulty. We'd go long periods without much contact, and both of us would tell ourselves it was just the nature of separate lives. But he stopped. He said he was sorry for that he should have tried harder. His voice was even, but barely. He said he thought of me often. The kitchen was very quiet. Willa said, "He left you the ranch." Garrett looked up. She said, "Not because there was no one else, because he thought it should be yours. That is in the formal papers too. if you read the language of the bequest carefully. He could have left it to be sold outright. He chose to leave it in terms that required someone to come and try to save it. She paused. He knew you would come. Garrett was still for a long time. Then he reached across the table and turned the lamp up slightly, though the room was already bright enough, in the way that people do things with their hands when their feelings require occupation. He said, "He wasn't wrong about you." She said, "No." He said, "About any of it." She picked up her pen and turned back to the ledger that still needed its final entries, and he picked up the fence diagram that still needed its review. And the morning continued the way mornings do, without pause, without sentiment, with the ordinary insistence of a day that has things in it requiring attention. But before she turned to the first page, she reached into the pocket of her dress and took out the piece of paper she had been carrying for 3 weeks, the fragment of Caleb's unsent letter, the single line she had found in the fireplace that had not quite burned. She set it on the table where Garrett could see it, if he looked. He looked. He read the 7 words written there. "I hope she stays." He looked at Willa. She was writing in the ledger, her pen moving steadily across the page, her attention apparently on the numbers in front of her. But she had placed the paper where he could see it, and that was its own kind of language, in the way that second cups of coffee and burning lamps and space made on a coat hook were their own kind of language. Small and plain and entirely clear to the person it was meant for. He looked at the 7 words for a moment longer. Then he looked at her. She did not look up, but the corner of her mouth moved, very slightly, in the way of someone who knows they are being looked at, and has decided to let it happen. He reached for his coffee. He turned back to his diagram. Outside, the light came through the window at its usual angle, steady and unhurried, and the house held them both in the ordinary quiet of a morning that was simply and entirely home.